Why Sargon deserves to win. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and over the course of my channel, I've made it no secret that I'm a big fan of Sargon of Akkad, but while I've mentioned him casually, and noted in a description that I dedicated a video to him, the only time I made a video strictly about my feelings towards him had to do with one of the major topics I felt he wasn't particularly well versed in, which was that I felt his views on racial disparities in the United States regarding the black population were a bit shallow. Though over time, I've agreed with certain aspects of his criticism more and more, but that's a long story. However, I'm going to make this video strictly about why I like him, and I want to preface this video by stating that although I know numerous friends of his, I am not personal friends with Carl Benjamin at all. We've never once spoken, and in fact, he's never spoken of me that I know of, aside from once saying I could come discuss Silicon Valley in a live stream under V's mentioning of the fact that I sent him a private message about it. So if anybody is wondering, no, this video will not be biased in terms of my fond feelings of Carl Benjamin as a personal friend, because, if anything, it would be cool to chat with him, though it's never actually happened, and I could choose to feel offended and rejected if I wanted to. But, ultimately, the fact that he hasn't ever reached out to have a talk with me doesn't actually offend me, as taking such offense in entertainment is a pointless idea. It's petty and childish. And ultimately, the fact that I think that he objectively makes the most well-rounded political videos on YouTube trumps all of that. Now, as to the point of this video, the first thing I should point out is that I did have some very significant reservations about his candidacy. Not that I wouldn't theoretically want him to be elected to the MEP position as a free speech advocating centrist who is about 94% supportive of my long-standing fundamental political views, if not possibly more. Rather, the main thing I worried about was his electability, and this was because I didn't think he was a particularly good debater, a sentiment which many people have long shared, back as far as when he debated Christy Winters, which should have been like shooting a pig in a barrel, but he had some trouble with, though for the record, I think he won the debate at this exact moment.
So, it looks like we've got other questions.
Right. I'm not arguing that feminism in history didn't have a role. I'm saying that right now, it doesn't have a role. Right now, it isn't consistent, it doesn't make any sense, it's based on biased information that probably isn't true by the people who do the fucking studies, and they are literally saying, would you please stop doing this, and yet feminists won't. I'm not asking you to tell me what's in other people's heads, I'm asking you whether you think this is damaging feminism's reputation.
All right. Well, let's move on to another question, if Christy does not wish to respond to that. Sargon, question for you. Sure. Do you think more feminists...
There was a lot leading up to that moment, largely about the fact that Obama had perpetuated the provably false statistic that 1 in 5 women are raped on university campuses, and whether or not that was a good look for feminism, which for the record, as an overall loosely strung together organization, has had researchers duplicate the same purposefully misleading study numerous times after the original statisticians came forward in Time magazine to claim their study was bogus. So that was his absolute most potent point, and as you saw, she repeatedly refused to even answer the question. Full stop, debate over. But beyond that, his MythCon debate with Richard Carrier was extremely unfortunate, as it kind of felt like as if Carrier had no idea what Sargon's actual definition of social justice really even was, which has simply been a communist dog whistle since I believe the 1960s. And it was as if Richard Carrier was arguing in favor of legitimate social justice, as opposed to the intersectional feminist, communist-rooted travesty that social justice has merely been code for a while. Kind of like the fake definition of racism. Seeing Sargon debate a seemingly nice enough man running into it axe-waving like Leroy Jenkins was kind of a bit hard to watch.
a leap of assumption.
In every community. There is a
But you don't have any evidence of that causation. You're just assuming that's the cause. This is
been
what I don't
there.
like about your work. Is
I was in this.
But that, no,
Oh,
That doesn't-
my lived
that's not
experience is
evidence.
suddenly not relevant.
No.
All of these people's lived
That
experience
is
is
not what I
suddenly not
said.
relevant.
This is what I don't like about you.
Oh,
is
I
that
don't care what you don't like about
no,
me. I
you
can
were
get
straw
stormed
manning
off
me.
the stage then.
No, look what you do.
If
You
you
keep
don't like
straw
it-
manning me. You keep ignoring the things
I'm
I'm
not-
saying and saying I'm not what I'm saying. I'm saying the opposite of what that is.
You are here to defend social justice.
no,
You know what
you're
social
sitting
justice
here.
does.
You're being disingenuous. You are.
However, after seeing him do a nice enough debate with a complete wacko on his channel a few months ago, I was starting to wonder if he's thought deeply about his lack of tact in speaking to people he disagrees with. And now, I believe very strongly that he clearly has, after watching this from a few days ago.
I also want to know why
Yes.
you wouldn't apologise for it, even when some members of your party have kind of encouraged you to do so. Why you wouldn't just say,
Okay.
all right, I want it to be controversial, but it was out of place. It was kind of, you know, it was disrespectful. Actually, I think, even though it's phrased in the negative, which I think is no excuse.
It was deliberately disrespectful.
So why won't you apologise?
Because
Wouldn't it have been
I-
the best political decision to have done so?
I don't agree, because I don't think that they're asking in good faith.
Well, I'm asking in good faith.
Then I'm sorry that you're offended.
And what about everybody else that would have been offended?
Well, they
by
can
it?
come to me and ask me if I'll apologise.
Why
And
not- why not
hang on,
publicly do it?
and if I feel that they are genuinely offended, if they come to me and say, look, I'm actually really upset by this, then I will apologise to those
So
people.
That being said, I no longer particularly doubt Sargon's electability, knowing how popular Brexit actually is with the citizens of the UK and his overall popularity as a public figure. I think he'll bring out a lot of new voters and people who are fans of people like Tommy Robinson, who feel silenced and afraid of being arrested for minor infractions on the internet. Also, it doesn't hurt that the sadistic weasels of England like Jess Phillips, her minions, and the wretchedly dishonest journalists that support her keep digging themselves deeper into a ditch of dishonest, paranoid, victim-longing insanity every time they try to smear him by stating that he made a joke about raping Jess Phillips by making the exact opposite statement, because it actually gives him a super great opportunity to look good in the process by proving his point to the public and simultaneously making them look bad. Dave Cullen of Computing Forever actually made a really good video where he went into detail about the exact mechanics of the Jess Phillips tweet, and another thing he briefly mentioned about Sargon being familiar with internet culture, which was a really important thing to bring up. And it's such an important thing that I feel a need to expand upon it for this video a good deal, because this is something very few people truly understand in the way that Dave Cullen, Carl Benjamin, and I actually do. You see, I know for a fact that the three of us were all essentially social media pioneers, not in the way that we created social media platforms, but the way that we were all essentially using social media for a very long time. Though granted, I don't know if Dave Cullen has used social media as long as Sargon and myself, but I assume it's a similar amount of time. Here's the thing. Lots of people think that social media started with Facebook, basically, and think of MySpace as the true original that never got so popular. But this is dramatically incorrect from my view. Sargon, like myself, was actually using things like AOL in the mid-90s, or maybe even earlier, though personally I never actually got on AOL. And being that he's a few years older than I am, he was probably better at navigating the more social aspects of it than I was at the time. Personally, although I had email since the early 90s, as my father was a computer science professor and such things were very important to him, I didn't really get into what I now call proto-social media until around 1998, when I first began using mailing lists that revolved around underground electronic music parties, which prompted me to eventually move to message boards by 1999. Now, I realize that stating this sounds relatively shallow by itself and might not properly express the full weight of such an internet history, but there's some very important things to keep in mind. You see, everybody I know who has been extremely active on the internet for a very long time sees the world in a dramatically different way than people who've only gotten on social media mid to late last decade or during this decade. For example, one of the first things that everybody remembers about their first experiences with social media and the internet is the first time they get into a public flame war, which usually traumatizes the dramatic majority of people. Because being publicly insulted, shamed, or trolled is an extremely upsetting experience, especially if it's never happened to you. And no, I'm not using the new fake definition of troll, which is the #1 definition of it on the Urban Dictionary. I'm referring to the times in which people said whatever they could to get a rise of you by making statements that they don't even agree with, which more than often are also entirely untrue because the person doing it was bored and they thought it was funny. Anyhow, I promise this will come back to Sargon in a moment, but my first public flame war was when I was no older than 16 or 17, and it revolved around me writing an email list review of a private dance party and shouting out a number of friends who I had seen there. This was a completely common thing to do, minus the fact that I didn't realize it was a private party, as I was brought with a friend, and somebody on the mailing list decided he was offended by me posting about a private party. It got even weirder because the majority of people I shouted out were female, as I was a teenaged gay kid back in the 1990s, who was still somewhat nervous around most males, gay or straight, unless they were completely unattractive and extremely nice gay men who didn't hit on me. Thus, it was really terrifying to me when some guy no younger than his mid-20s ended up picking a fight with me, complaining about the way I should never write reviews of parties that not everybody was invited to, which, again, I didn't even know it was private, and then going on to talk about how I was obviously just there to hit on all the girls, because of all the nice things I said to the females in that party review. I mean, being that I was gay, it was very easy to state out loud if I felt a woman or girl was beautiful, and I likely did, but I guess, being that he didn't know I was gay, that bothered him. Obviously, it will come as no surprise to find out that his little plan of embarrassing me somewhat backfired on him, as about 6 or 7 female friends of mine fiercely defended me, but ultimately, his intended plan did still end up working. It was one of the most humiliating experiences of my young life, and I remember the feeling and the exact name of the guy like it was yesterday. That being said, the reason I bring this up is that it happened about 20 years ago, then eventually again, and eventually again, though different circumstances. And yes, you absolutely did and had to get used to such things back then, because literally nobody policed the internet in practically any capacity for a long while, as even message boards that had "don't threaten people or you'll be banned" rules seemingly rarely bothered to enforce them. It was so crazy online back in the 1990s that I remember once coming across a gay male porn site that had a page called Ex-Boyfriend Revenge Pictures, which had at least 6 or 7 completely naked photos of good-looking gay men, often in poses like these, and as far as I know, it took years for that site to be taken down. And so, eventually you not only had to learn to grow used to crazy photos and a thick skin to insults, to the point where you usually started getting creative with zingers of your own to throw in response, but more so, you started to realize that even what is seen as the most awful behavior on the internet, threats, should generally be simply ignored, because almost never does anything actually come from these things. I assure you, I got dozens and dozens of threats of violence and death from the message boards centered around my own geographical location, and literally nothing ever happened. And I know for a fact that these people were really, really mad at me because they could not stand the fact that a young gay kid was beating them in arguments and stuff. And they were legitimately anti-gay. Therefore, I can only assume that Carl Benjamin has this exact type of story regarding his early life on social media, and while I don't know if he was on most sites that would officially be considered social media by today's standard, which started with a site most people have not even heard of called Friendster, then MySpace, Facebook, and even a completely dead one called Tribe.net, which turned out to be corrupt, I do know he's never left the internet. And so, it was not at all hard for him to come up with the perfect way to get Jess Phillips with that tweet, and show the world that she was a dishonest, overreacting, censorship-loving zealot who doesn't seem to understand the internet, because he knew perfectly well she'd fall right into his trap and never let it go. Which is very relevant to her because clearly understanding social media should be a prerequisite for anybody trying to write laws around it. That all being said, there's one more point I want to focus on regarding Carl Benjamin's personal history, which I think many people will undoubtedly ignore. That is, the fact that he's a gamer, and I believe a lifelong dedicated gamer like myself, which is a character trait that I feel to be invaluable in today's world. You see, what people really underestimate about gaming is the way it trains you to be meritocratic, a bit more fair to reality and other people. It certainly trains you to see things more objectively, and it trains you to become adaptable as an individual. Because really, aside from necessarily teaching you deep social skills, though today's team games do at least teach you a few social skills, gaming basically gives you a huge majority of the really hard to teach skills to navigate today's world. I've spoken about this phenomenon in the past, mainly in my video called Why the Political Establishment Hates Video Games. But basically, gamers are people who strive for excellence in quickness and intelligence, because literally every game is ultimately not just a challenge in problem solving, but an exercise of learning skills both in operating systems and goal-oriented struggles, and often some teamwork. Check out my video if you want to learn more. Therefore, I legitimately believe that a gamer who understands the internet on a social level, who is just the right age to be well educated in the perfect way to be extremely knowledgeable about all things relevant to the politics of his time and region, as well as the socio-political debates powering culture, I believe such a person is an absolutely perfect individual to be in some small office. Maybe not Prime Minister, but certainly MEP. Finally, I want to mention that although I personally find much of Sargon's cultural videos and opinions almost entirely correct, as well as finding him quite funny from time to time, that's not the only positive quality he has shown to me on YouTube, though I think few people realize this. In fact, his video A Tale of Two Narratives Part 1 was something even my mother, who is definitely a leftist, even though she's oddly a huge fan of Jordan Peterson, enjoyed immensely, enough to even show to her roommate when I wasn't even around, which is saying something because it's an hour and a half long, and isn't presented in his usual humorous style, which means he can do other types of things well. What I'm saying is that I believe Carl Benjamin to be more aware than just about anybody I know of the way that the populace thinks, due to his understanding of the primary place people communicate these days, the internet. I also believe that he is politically knowledgeable, and I believe he is extremely adaptable, not just because of his differing styles of videos he's composed, but because, quite frankly, he's a gamer. And that's why I, Prince of Queens, an American, personally endorses him in his candidacy for UK MEP. If you enjoyed this video, please do follow me on Minds.com and consider sponsoring me on Subscribestar. I'm new to the site and I don't have a lot of support there, and I'm going through a lot of personal financial troubles.